Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin. This is a waddle through all the Penguin classics that I have or have ever owned or ever plan to own. And our book today is a slim volume, not of poetry, not exactly. This is Basho, who lived from 1644 to 1694. Even though, thanks to his presence in all sorts of old etchings like this, he feels like an ancient author. He's actually not an ancient author. He was writing his greatest works at the same time that John Locke was writing his greatest works. And his greatest works, it could be argued, are not in this little volume from Penguin. This little volume is from 1966, and it is The Narrow Road to the Deep North and other travel sketches, the travel writings that Basho did. Because at the midway point in his life, when he found himself in a dark wood, he decided that it suited his fancy to go wandering. Sometimes with nothing more than his staff and the clothes on his back. And sometimes for long stretches of time. The Narrow Road to the Deep North is the travel sketch that he did of commemorating the longest of his wanderings. And that's what this book is. And what Basho did for those was to merge passages of very beautiful prose with passages of verse, specifically haiku, which you will know if you've ever tried it in school, is a stanza of verse that has one line is 5 syllables, the middle line is 7 syllables, the final line is 5 syllables, 575. In Basho's day, that was known as hokku. And Basho himself said that although he's famous, he's absolutely famous for haiku. If you mention haiku, you will have to mention Basho's name in the same sentence, or you'll go to jail. Even though he's famous for that, he himself maintained to his friends and also to the disciples. He had literary disciples for most of his life, which I've never had. He maintained for most of his literary life that he was not better at haiku than his disciples were, for instance, or some of his friends, that his real strength lay in Renga. Hikano Renga, which is it's a type of verse activity that we don't really do in the Western world. We did once upon a time, but not in any advertised way, where you write a bit of a poem, maybe a haiku, maybe not, and then a friend of yours, another poet, continues it, writes the next little batch of that sentiment, or the previous batch. It was a very non-linear thing here, a very non-linear attitude towards a lot of verse making. Basho, at a few different points in his life, including very poignantly at the end of his life, would craft a bit of prose, a little glimpse of something. And his attendants, the people at his bedside, his disciples and whatnot, wouldn't know where it was going to go and wouldn't know whether or not they should add to the front of it or the back of it. And sometimes you get the charming impression that Basho himself didn't know. But this book is a translation into English of the travel sketches. So we have the records of a well-exposed skeleton, of a weather-exposed skeleton, which is very early. It's the first major travel sketch, and it's trying a little too hard, I think, is what the common critical parlance would be. Then a visit to the Kashima Shrine, the records of a well-worn satchel, a visit to the Sarashina Shrine, to the Sarashina village, and finally the Narrow Road to the Deep North, which is the culminating piece in this book, which also includes, if I remember correctly, yes, it also includes fairly detailed maps so that you can kind of make out where Basho is actually going, what he's actually talking about. And the translations here are by Nobuyuki Yuasa, who had done a couple of Japanese verse translations before this. And he has a wonderful introduction here. It's a very moving introduction, and also a defense of his own translation ethos, which we're going to have to deal with in your Daily Penguin. We are going to deal with the pitiless ratio of time, how some of the works that we're going to be looking at barely survived to reach us at all, and often in unbelievably adulterated form, so that we literally have no idea what the originals were like, or almost no idea. And we're also going to deal with the vagaries of translation. We're going to have to. Penguin Classics has been doing translations right from the beginning. The very first Penguin Classic was a work in translation, not a work in English. And therefore, it behooves translators, especially it has come to behoove them, to defend their translation practices, their translation philosophy. And that's good in this case, because this translator has a very marked translation philosophy that you will either agree with or fundamentally disagree with. I marked it here with a Beagle bookmark. Let's hear from Nobuyuki Yuasa. Let's hear from him. One final comment on the technique of translation. I have used a 4-line stanza in translating haiku. Are you out? Are you out? He's decided to translate these things in 4 lines instead of 3. I shall not, of course, try to defend my stanza, for it is an experiment, and just as any other experiment in literature, the result alone can justify or disqualify it. Let me, however, state here at least 3 reasons for my choice. First, the language of haiku, as I have already pointed out, is based on colloquialism, and in my opinion, the closest approximation of natural conversational rhythm can be achieved in English by a 4-line stanza rather than a constrained 3-line stanza. No offense to you or your honored ancestors, but that is bull hockey. Let's see what your second answer is. Second, even in lifetime of Basho's hokku, which he describes as the starting place of a linked verse, was given a special place in the series and treated half independently. And in my opinion, 3-line stanza does not carry adequate dignity and weight to compare with hokku. And finally, I had before me the task of translating a great number of poems mixed with prose, and I find it impossible to use 3-line form consistently. In any case, this translation is primarily intended for lovers of poetry and only secondarily for scholars whose minds should be broad enough to recognize the use in translation like this. The present translation is not for those purists who insist, without believing either in its validity or possibility, I presume, that haiku should be translated with the original 17-syllable scheme, or at least into 3 lines. He talks about the illustrations that are all throughout this book, which are by Buson. The illustrations of the text are by Buson, who is counted not only among the 3 best haiku poets of Japan, but also among the outstanding painters of his day. By way of concluding my introduction, and here he means by defending himself, let me quote the inscription of a poem from the portrait of Basho by Buson used for the cover. And this is that poetic inscription. Neither speak ill of others nor well of yourself. The moment you open your mouth to speak, the autumn wind stirs and chills your lips. So that is our translator subtly warning his critics ahead of time. Don't criticize what I'm trying to do here. It'll be up to you whether or not it works. It's, I think, less impact here than it would be in the work that I should have here, the work that I should be holding up. The travel sketches are a weird, I think incredibly endearing combination of verse and prose. And this translator and many other commentators of Basho have said that the way you determine his growth in the form of the travel sketches he was doing is how wonderfully, seamlessly in dialogue the verse is with the prose. In the early travel sketches, the weather-beaten, weather-worn skeleton and such, that relationship is bumpy and sometimes feels very stiff, very artificial. Sometimes the poetry is overriding everything. Sometimes the prose is just there to explain the poetry, or vice versa. And that gets better. It gets more advanced, more thoughtful as time goes on. And so the Narrow Road to the Deep North is, despite its brevity, I mean, it take you an hour to read, it's a towering masterpiece. Just an unbelievable thing. And even in English translation, I cannot read this in the original. Even in English translation, it's an unbelievably moving piece. Just wonderful. And about far more than just the author hoofing it on the road to an Arby's in the next town over. It's about a lot more than that. It's really about the journey in italics with a capital J. It's really about that. The place, the person, the destination really doesn't matter. It's at the very least the text for all travel writing, but I believe there's much more going on there than that. And I think you can see glimmers of that in the earlier travel sketches, even the ones that were done to commemorate very little time, comparatively speaking, on the road. But I should be holding up a different Basho volume. I should be holding up, he wrote a lot of poetry in his life, and he also happily collaborated with lots of other poets, and also brought out their own work, with himself either entirely absent from the volume or deeply in the background. And of all of that work, traditionally in Japanese literature, there have been 7 major anthologies of Basho. Some of which he's not the only name in them, others of which he is. Others of which they're anthologies of his own work. And those anthology sounds very big, it sounds very weighty in English parlance, but those 7 major anthologies, as they're called, they even have a title of their own in Japanese literature, or they did once upon a time. Those 7 anthologies would not be a big Penguin volume at all. They even with copious amounts of commentary, which there's been brilliant commentary on those 7 anthologies over the last century, much less over the last 3 centuries. There's been brilliant commentary. A lot of it's never been translated. And an introduction and maps and whatnot. Even with all of that, the 7 major anthologies of Basho as a Penguin classic would be no bigger than Don Quixote. Far smaller than that, I would bet. It would be nice. If Penguin has ever made a volume like that, I don't know about it. If they've ever made a Basho volume other than this one, I've never seen it. But they certainly haven't done this figure justice. They certainly haven't done that. So it'd be nice. It'd be nice if they did. There are others, of course. Basho is always translated, but it'd be nice if my beloved Penguin Classics did. So that's, I guess, another element that we're going to be dealing with in your Daily Penguin. Not only the pitiless ratio of time and not only the vagaries of translation, but Steve's gripes. But even so, I imagine that Penguin still comes out with this volume, even 60 years later. I'm sure that they have some Basho in print. You should find it. If you're not familiar with this figure, even in English, you should find it. And read him and maybe try your hand. One of the neatest things about haiku, let's leave Renga or Hoku out for the moment. One of the neatest things about haiku is that it's easy to try yourself. It's almost impossible to get really good at it because it involves so much that's implied. What our translator here refers to as colloquialisms, which is not true. It is not true. There are barely any colloquialisms in Basho. I don't know what he's talking about there. I think it's just I think the thing that bothered him is the concision, the excision. In order to make a haiku really sing, you have to leave a lot to the reader's understanding. A lot more than most writers, especially most translators, are willing to do. But you can try your hand at it right away. All you have to do is be able to count syllables. And when you try that, and when you read this book, you may find, I have occasionally thought, heretically, that some of Basho's work in his travel sketches, especially the early travel sketches, is a little bit on the precious side, a little bit on the performative side. I'm intentionally trying to find the picturesque or piquant moment in this early morning when I've got up to pee in my bowl or whatnot. I'm intentionally trying to look for exquisite things, which prompted me to a haiku of my own, which I wrote in this book eons ago. Let's see, where did I put it? I put it on a blank page. There we go. A haiku of my own to commemorate the sometimes showy early travel sketches of Basho. Walking in the wood, surrounded by green beauty, epigram hunting. And that is bad, of course, but you see at least what I'm getting at here, which is that you're not describing, you're not putting 2 and 2 together all the way through the poem for the reader. The reader is to understand what you are implying, which is that the writer of the poem is ignoring the beauty all around him in order to find an epigram. That kind, not to compare my haiku to Basho's, but that kind of nimble awareness on the part of the reader is necessary for haiku that is great. And there's a lot of that in this. There's a lot of great stuff in here. There's a lot of prose as well. Basho was very good at prose, so at least as far as I can tell, I am reading a translation here. But it's a translation I strongly recommend. This is a very good volume. A long introduction, those maps, lots and lots of critical stuff at the end, illustrations all throughout. So that's your Daily Penguin for today, The Narrow Road to the Deep North by Basho. And we'll wrap this up for now. We'll see what we do next time. Thank you, BookTube.